Just after World War I, a young man dropped out of high school and went to work for a large ranch in central Nevada. Now, on one of his daily rides, he traveled out to a place that he called Whiskey Barrel Springs. And he went beyond the springs into a canyon. Now, the story was that this canyon had a hideout for some robbers back in the 1870s. They had been robbing stagecoaches in the area. Finally, the military got tired of what they were doing and came in and rooted them out around 1879. A large gun battle ensued, and the robbers were all wiped out. But in the process, 3 of the soldiers were killed. The soldiers pulled the robbers' bodies out of the cabin that they were in, piled them up and burned them, and then they set fire to the log cabin and burned it down too. They then took the 3 soldiers that had died. Now, this is the story that was related to me by a friend of mine who had been friends with the old man. And they had actually traveled into the desert between Elko, Nevada and Ely, Nevada, searching for this treasure. And they were out there for about 2 weeks. Well, they never found anything, but they had this neat story to tell. So years after the fact, I got to know Terry, the friend of the old man that had actually been the cowboy, and he related the story to me. And I was moving at the time to Utah and knew that I'd only be about 4.5 hours away from the area that supposedly this story took place. So over the next 4 years, because I've always been an outdoor guy and always enjoyed hiking and that in the woods anyway, I would go out into the summer, probably 6-7 times, 2 to 3 days at a time, into the desert of Nevada and search for this robber's roost. Well, needless to say, I didn't find too much, but I got what I thought was closer and closer. And eventually, I picked an area that I thought was a pretty good likelihood. So I drove my 4-wheel drive out to the mouth of this canyon. I had an ATV on a trailer in the back, got on the ATV and rode it just as far up the canyon as I possibly could, and then got off the ATV and started to walk. Now, in my searching in the desert, I'd come across several different cabins or old mining camps. What I found was a structure, but it was unlike any of the structures that I had seen. First of all, it was primarily stone and wood mixed together and could not have accommodated a roof, a build-on roof. You could have just laid some poles across it, but it wasn't really set up, and they would have been at an angle the way the walls were, and they were uneven. It was kind of like 6 or 7-year-old kid had gone out and made a fort. Well, I didn't think too much of it, and I hiked up beyond this structure and got into the canyon. And I came to the point where the canyon was very steep on both sides, and there were a couple of different seeps where the sand was wet and a couple places actually small pools of water because the canyon walls were so steep. Well, I continued up this canyon and came to kind of a stone wall, which would have been kind of like a cliff that had fallen over on its side. And there was about a 45-degree angle in this cliff. And I hiked up it. It only went up 30-40 feet, but I was able to basically crawl up it on my hands and knees or walk. Got to the top, and at the top of it, the brush became incredibly thick. I mean, it got so that I could probably only see 30 feet in any direction. Well, I'm kind of, hiking, making my way through this brush because I'm having to kind of zigzag to avoid the largest, densest parts of the brush. And suddenly I stop and I hear way up above, uphill and to my right, a crashing begin to come through the brush. Now at first, I think it's a landslide because it is really loud and a lot of brush is just crashing and popping and smashing and every which way. But as I listen more closely, I begin to realize, no, it's not a rock slide. Something is running through the brush, but just making a tremendous noise as it does it. Now, I'm not even thinking what it could be at this point, because it's basically coming directly at me. And I'm not sure what to think because it was completely unexpected. Well, this goes on for about 20 seconds and it gets up to just out of my sight and then veers off from where I am. So I still cannot see anything, but I can still hear this tremendous crashing going on in the brush. It goes around the front, again, just out of vision, and then goes off to my left, the other side, and begins to go uphill, continuing the crashing and smashing of wood and everything that's going on, has been going on since it was uphill. And then it gets to what I figure is about 100, 150 feet away, and then suddenly stops. And there's not a sound. Now, I didn't really think about it too much at the time because obviously this was a little disconcerting that there weren't any bird sounds, there weren't any animal sounds at that moment in the canyon. And it just went completely still. Well, I listened, and I thought, well, the only large animals I'd seen in the canyon were some wild horses, which I saw every time I went up there, and I'd seen elk a couple times. I'd seen a big bull elk running through some cedar trees. And I figured, well, I guess that must be an elk. I mean, a bear would not do what it did, and also I don't think they were bear. I mean, remember, this is the desert. This is a canyon with a little bit of water in it, but the rest of the canyon, or the rest of the area is very dry, arid desert. So anyway, I continued that, went out that way, never did see anything. I did in fact find what I figured was the cave where the gold or whatever, the robbers' loot had been hidden. Found a little wall that had been mortised with stones. There was there on the top end too. And I looked down into the cave, and the cave was full of silt and mud. Apparently over the years, rain had run through. So I was thinking, oh boy, I found something. Well, I took several more trips out there with a pick and shovel and dug that cave out from the bottom. And lo and behold, when I dug it all out, there was nothing there. But I figured somebody had beaten me to it because the cave was as the fellow had described in the story. Mortised with stones, and it was kind of a tunnel going through, and inside it, some stuff had been hidden. Well, needless to say, as it wasn't for years after this that I started studying and reading about Sasquatches in the state of Utah and in the Intermountain area. And I found that several accounts existed where people had actually seen Sasquatches in the mountains, the dry mountains of central Nevada. And that's where I got to feel that, hey, I had to have been bluff charged at this point because no other creature that I can think of would have done that, and no other creature would have built those structures. And you have to understand this too. I was way out in the middle of nowhere. I mean, when I was up that canyon, I doubt there'd been another human up that canyon in 50 years. So that's my story. Hopefully it's entertaining.